Well, since I didn't get to say this to most of you last week, Happy New Year. Anytime we have weather coming in, we always have the conversation about church. Should we, cancel services or condense to one service? And a certain staff member, I won't name names, but he started this church 30 years ago. He's the one who goes, we've never canceled, and like the pressure's on me now to make sure I never cancel. And he goes, and especially 8 o'clock. You never want to cancel that one. People are going to show up. Counting myself, Stefan, Gary, who plays keyboard over here, and Kyle, who was running sound, we had 4 people show up for 8 o'clock service. We did have one guy come in who was helping shovel. He's at the 10:45 service a lot. He came in a few minutes late. After about 15 minutes, Gary goes, "So are we going to have this service or not?" I said, let's just all go downstairs. We had 20 people here, counting all of the staff that was here, and the staff spouses that were here, and the crew back in the sound booth and up on the stage. 20. For those of you who are curious, yes, James was here in his shorts and t-shirt last week. He has informed me that if I'm still around when he passes away, this is what he wants to be buried in, a Crossroads t-shirt and some shorts. We would expect nothing less, right? At the last service, we had 5 people show up, including one of our elders and his children who are pastors. And I'm preaching a sermon geared towards new people coming to Christ. So altogether, I think we had 26 people here. Somehow we brought 50 people to Christ, and it was mostly staff and elders that were here, which is concerning. No, we're glad you guys are here this week. Hopefully you were able to catch us online last week. If you didn't, I'd encourage you to go back and watch that or listen to that. We started this brand new series called All In. And the purpose behind this series, I said this last week, I'm not a big New Year's resolution kind of guy, but often what I try to do is kind of hit the reset button a little bit. Not necessarily start a bunch of new things or stop a bunch of old things, but just refocus a little bit going into a new year. It's always a good time to maybe get back into working out, or a good time is to change your diet a little bit, or good time to start reading the Bible all the way through yet again. And I thought, man, what if as a church we kind of made that same commitment? Like, not necessarily anything new, we just re-engage a little bit with the things that we're supposed to be doing. And we said this series is going to look at 5 attitudes, 5 things that we can kind of say to ourselves as we do this. Last week we said I'm invited, and we talked about how we're invited to Jesus' table. And if you've been a part of Crossroads for a long time, the challenge for you is, what are you going to do with the person who comes and sits at that chair if you say, well, you don't belong there? Like, that's kind of our natural instinct sometimes, and what do we do with that? Today it's a little bit different topic, and before we jump into this, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here. And I'm curious for those of you, especially probably you Gen Xers and millennials, this is going to appeal to you. Some of you may understand this as well too, but I'm curious for you, what when you were younger was the mode you used to listen to music? I don't mean the radio. I mean, like, what did you capture music on? For me, growing up in the 80s, it was cassette tapes. 8 tracks were kind of on their way out. It was cassette tapes. That gave way to CDs. And then eventually, by the time, I get into high school and beyond, we have everything is on some kind of a device. And when I got into college, there was a device released by Apple called the iPod. You might remember this. It's been around for quite a while now. It's actually evolved eventually into the iPhone. But the iPod, Apple made this, and it came out in 2001, cost $400. It held 1,000 songs, and its functions were this: it played music. That's it. Now, later versions did other things, but the original iPod held 1,000 songs, cost $400, and it played music, and that was it. About a few years later, Microsoft came out with one called the Zune. The Zune cost $250, almost half the price of the iPod. It held 7,500 songs compared to 1,000. You could play videos on it. It held thousands of pictures. You could even stream, or not stream at the time, it was a tuner for radio. You could listen to radio on it if you wanted to. You could play games on it. It had compatibility with other devices. Just stacking it up, its list of what it could do dwarfed the iPod at almost half the price. And yet the iPod outsold the Zune almost 5-1. And people who were asked, over almost 80% of iPod owners said, yeah, they loved it, they would recommend somebody buy it. Less than 10% of Zune owners said, yeah, I would tell somebody to go buy this product. Think about this for just a minute here. You have this one device that worked fairly well, had all these functions, and yet nobody wanted it. You know what their number one complaint was? There's just too much going on with it. Remember what the iPod did? It played music. One song after the next. Sometimes I think we get so overwhelmed by options and choices that you kind of lose sight of what you're supposed to be doing. Maybe you've gone to a restaurant, even a fast food place, McDonald's or Whataburger or some of these, and you sit there looking at the menu for a couple minutes because you just don't really know what you want or what you're in the mood for. I don't know, has anybody ever been to In-N-Out? You know, they're mostly West Coast burger places, but you know what the options are at In-N-Out? A hamburger or a cheeseburger. And if you're really feeling crazy, a double cheeseburger. That's it. That's the menu. And you go in there, it's simple. In fact, most In-N-Outs you go to, the line is like out the door, you know, wrapped around the building, and that's your options. There was a donut place in my hometown. You went in there, she told you what you wanted. It was a lady from Southeast Asia, told us what we wanted. And once you made your order, that was your order from then on. I'd walk in, I want a pink donut and an orange donut. Okay. Next day, I want a maple bar. No, you want a pink and an orange. I think I want a maple. No, you want a pink and an orange. You know what? I think I'll take a pink and an orange today, actually. Sometimes simplicity is better. I'm all for trying new things. I'm all for having more options and more experiences, but yet sometimes the simple things are the better. David Allen once said, you can do anything, but not everything. When I was younger, I was one of those kind of teenagers. A lot of what I tried to do, I'm not saying this as a brag, but I just was kind of naturally good at most things. Now, not sports, but most other things. I could naturally pick them up and be decent to fairly good at them. But I was never great at anything. And it was as I got later in life, I realized, you know what, I can't be great at everything. My oldest daughter is going through this. She wants to be great at everything she does. And I said, you're going to have to eventually focus a little bit into just a few things. If you want to be a great shot, it doesn't matter where you're aiming if you're not aiming at the correct target. Back when we duck hunted all the time, we would have flocks of birds come in, my buddy Cord and I. If we had 20, 30 ducks came in, we usually killed none. If we had 2 or 3 come in, we could knock those down. But when you have all of them, it's like, I don't really even know where to shoot. Sometimes in life, we get the same way. We kind of get overwhelmed by just so much going on that we don't focus on any one thing. As we get into a new year, I see a lot of people on social media talk about having a focus, having an intentionality coming into a new year. So let me ask you a question. What's your focus for 2025? Not to say you've set a resolution, not to say you've written down a goal, but if you could just kind of pick one area, what's your focus for 2025? Maybe it is, something along the lines of you want to get a promotion at work. You want to earn a raise at work. Maybe it's you want to find a new job. Maybe your focus for this year is you want to be, more intentional as a husband or as a wife, or a little bit more focused as a parent with your kids. Maybe you want to be a better neighbor. Maybe it's a little more spiritual. Your focus for this year, you say, you know what, this is the year I'm going to read through the whole Bible this year. Or this is the year I'm going to memorize, a chunk of scripture. I'm going to memorize the Gospel of John. Big topic, a big goal or something. Maybe your focus for this year is I'm going to join a small group, or I'm going to serve in the church, or I'm going to make sure I can be here every Sunday. Let me ask you this. How many of you would say my focus for 2025 is I want to tell somebody about Jesus? That's it. It's not necessarily about an accomplishment that we can do, which are, all those things I mentioned are great, by the way. But what if our focus as a collective church is, I want to use who I am, use my influence to bring somebody to Jesus. You think about it, of all the things that you could accomplish this year, that's the only one that you can take with you to heaven. You can't take any of the rest, but you can take somebody with you to heaven. The problem I think that we have, too many of us don't think that we have enough influence to win people to Christ. We think that we have to be somebody. We think that we have to have some level of popularity or some platform or some certain number of followers behind us before we can win people to Christ. And you say, I don't have any of that. I don't have influence. Nobody really values or looks up to me, maybe like they do you or whatever it may be. And yet Jesus, in 7 simple words, told us that we do. Matthew chapter 5, he says, you are the salt of the earth. Those 7 words, they pack so much in there. Because what does salt do? Well, if I were to ask you, you'd say, well, salt flavors things, because that's what we use it for. But traditionally, and back in this culture, salt had 3 different uses. Yes, it was used to flavor things, but it was also used to preserve things and to purify things. How does that apply to us? Well, through the gospel, we purify the world around us. We want people to come to Jesus through what we say and do. We want to preserve the church and preserve the gospel message. That they would pack meat in salt to preserve it because they didn't have refrigeration back then. But for us, we preserve the gospel message. We don't let it get distorted or diluted by the world around us. We want to preserve the church so that the next generation has a healthy church to take over one day so that they can bring people to Jesus. You are the salt of the earth. Let me ask you a question as we get ready to dive into this today. If you were to think back on your life, think back, whether some of you who are a little bit older, maybe you think back to when you were a kid or a teenager. Or maybe you're a little younger in the room today. Maybe you're already right there today. If I were to ask you this question, what's your answer? Who's been the most influential person in your life? Who's been the most influential person in your life? If I stop and think about this, I could sit up here and rattle off names of people that you have never heard of and will never meet this side of heaven that have been influential to me. Often we think of it in different terms, but I think about my parents, of course, who made me into what I am today. My dad, who was a police officer. My mom, who now is kind of in a position of influence. She runs a nursing department at a college. But when I was growing up, she was a secretary for a lawyer who just was a single lawyer in an office. It wasn't a big law firm or anything. Small town attorney. And she answered the phones and kept his schedule for him. But my parents combined, growing up, my parents combined for 1 year of college and didn't make a ton of money. We weren't really influential people in our community by any stretch of the imagination. And outside of them, I think about my grandpa, who had a 6th grade education, had to drop out of school after 6th grade to go work the family farm. He was the youngest of 13 kids. I think about my grandma, who, there's this strong little woman who was by his side who influenced him to eventually come to church later in life. And when he did, he got all in right off the bat. And I think about how they've put a legacy of faith and ministry into our family now, where multiple of my generation and our family are in ministry. We're walking with God. Where would we be without all of that? I don't know. Don't know the answer to that. Who's been the most influential person in your life? It's probably not somebody who plays football on Sundays or makes music or makes movies. It's probably not a politician. It's probably somebody that most other people have never heard of and won't meet this side of heaven. See, the problem is we have changed this term influencer. This is a term that's really come up in the last few years. And if you say influencer, especially to a younger person, they're going to tell you about somebody on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, somebody with millions of followers. Because these are influencers who are helping teach young people kind of what to think and what to say and how to do things. That's how that term has come about. But can I just push back on that a little bit? I'm not trying to sound like the old head here, but maybe it's time we take that term back. Because to be an influencer, it doesn't matter how many followers you have. It matters what your heart is. My oldest daughter got a YouTube channel a few months ago. She was asking me for one. And, as parents, you kind of balance that when you're going to let your kids have any kind of social media. And we're not trying to keep our kids in a bubble necessarily. But I told her, I said, whatever you do, we're going to observe. We're going to watch. And she's like, well, I really want a YouTube channel. And I thought about that. I'm like, okay, I'll let you have a YouTube channel, partly out of just sheer morbid curiosity what she's going to come up with, because she's wired a lot like me. Like, she definitely got my coolness gene. My wife said that yesterday, and she didn't say it in a complimentary way, by the way. Mostly because Elsie and I were sitting around just rattling off trivial facts that nobody else cares about. And she's like, yeah, she is definitely your child, you know. But she, the other day, goes, I got 100 followers now. And yesterday, as we're driving home, we'd been to the store, she's like, I think the kids at my school know about my channel now. That could be a bad thing. She kind of says it like, oh no. She's like, yeah, like the most popular girl in school is following me. And I'm like, have fun. And then she's like, I've seen your YouTube channel. You have 12 followers. And I'm like, I forgot I had a YouTube channel, you know? Like, I started it a long time ago when I was getting into ministry because, you know, you had to push videos of yourself preaching and doing all these things you wanted churches to see. And I kind of forgot it exists since then. But she's like, well, how many Facebook friends do you have? I'm like, I don't know, like 3,000. She's like, really? I'm like, I don't even know who half of them are, Elsie. Like, and like I'll scroll through, like, yeah, I wasn't friends with this dude in high school. I'm not sure why we're Facebook friends now, but you know. I said, that number doesn't really mean anything though. It doesn't really matter. What matters is how you use it. When it comes to influence, too often we think we have influence based on the size of our platform. But to be an influencer, that doesn't matter. What matters is your heart for people. We're going to look at a story in John chapter 4 today. If you've got a Bible, you can turn there, about maybe the least likely or the most unlikely, best way to say that, person who had a lot of influence. John chapter 4, to set this up, Jesus has been down in Judea, in the southern half of Israel, and he's going back to Galilee in the north. And to do that, they passed through Samaria. And the Samaritans were people, let's just set this how the story works. The Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans were viewed as kind of a half-breed, a watered-down race. Basically, it was Jewish people who had married outside of the Jewish bloodline. So they looked at them as again, a watered-down breed of people. They were people who had insulted God to the Jewish people. That phrase, the Good Samaritan, that we use is an oxymoron to Jewish people of this culture. But Jesus is passing through there. And typically, any self-respecting Jewish man would just pass right on through and not interact with a Samaritan whatsoever. But look at this story as it unfolds. John chapter 4, verse 6, it says, Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. Anybody else read that and be like, me too, Jesus? Like, it kind of warms your heart that the Savior of the world occasionally just needed to sit down and rest and take a nap. It makes me feel a little better about myself and the current state I'm in, but that's just me. He was tired from the journey and he sat down by the well. It was about noon. Key detail there. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? The Samaritan woman said to him, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? We'll pause for a second here because there's a lot going on. John, his gospel is always very simple and very complex. I've heard it's shallow enough for a toddler to wade in, but deep enough that a whale could never find the bottom. John just tells you a little bit of detail in a story here. But what you might miss is, again, no self-respecting Jewish man would ever talk to a Samaritan. That's one. He also doesn't just go interact with a woman. That's two. And here's Jesus, a self-respecting, so to speak, Jewish man, talking to a Samaritan woman. I mean, it's like the perfect storm of breaking all of this, the social rules here. Now, I believe he's doing this because Jesus didn't care about the social rules. He's there to break down barriers that we built, that we created. But he tells her, starts the conversation, and he tells her, you're going to drink this water out of this well, and guess what? You're going to get thirsty again. But if you drink of me, you'll never be thirsty again because I'm the living water. And then he tells the woman, hey, go tell your husband about this. And the woman looks to him and goes, well, I don't have a husband. And he goes, yeah, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and you're currently sleeping with a man who's not your husband. Now, if we, in our culture, let's just be very honest here. Let's be very honest with ourselves. If we hear somebody say, and I'm not trying to sound judgmental here, but that's kind of the point of what I'm talking about. if we hear somebody say, oh yeah, I've been married 5 times, we judge them, right? I mean, like we have a thought that comes in our head. We jump to a conclusion about this person, man or woman, about what kind of person this must be to have had 5 spouses. And especially now if they're with somebody who isn't their spouse. We're going to jump to a conclusion there, whether we want to or not, whether we're trying to be judgmental or not. We have our thoughts about this person. And that's in today's culture where this is kind of acceptable. In this culture, it wasn't acceptable to be married more than once, unless your husband or wife had died. And here's a woman who's been married 5 times and is now with a man who's not her husband. Very similar to the woman we met last week, the woman who came and poured the perfume on the feet of Jesus, right? The woman who was, living a sinful lifestyle, Luke said. This is a woman that everybody in this town not only knows, but they know her story. So she comes to draw water at noon. They went and drew water first thing in the morning. This is a desert climate. It's hot in the afternoon. If you've ever lived anywhere where it's a desert climate, you don't do anything in the middle of the day. When I lived in Phoenix for a year, we played a lot of golf. It was always first thing in the morning. If you wanted a cheap tee time, you could get them all afternoon long because nobody was going out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when it was 120 degrees outside. But 6 a.m., those were expensive tee times and they were packed. People wanted those because you get out, you do all your work ahead of time. Maybe you've grown up on a farm or a ranch or you've been around those. You do your work early in the morning or later in the afternoon, later into the evening. You don't do it in the heat of the day. This woman's coming in the heat of the day to draw water. Why? Because she doesn't want to be judged. Because everybody knows her story. Everybody knows everything about her. She's not wearing a scarlet letter. She's basically wearing a full body scarlet tattoo. Everybody knows her story. And everywhere she goes, she's going to catch shame and judgment. And yet, when she asks Jesus questions and he starts to answer them, she comes to a realization of who he is. She says, what's the best way to worship? Your people worship in the temple, ours worship on the mountain. And he goes, I don't care about that. I want you to worship in spirit and truth in your heart. And then she asks him pretty point blank, are you the Messiah? And he's like, yeah. One of the few people Jesus actually says this to, by the way. And it says in verse 28, this woman left her water jar, went back into the town and said to people, come see a man who told me everything that I did. Could this be the Messiah? And they came out of the town and they made their way toward him. Do you think this is a woman that the general public's just going to believe everything that she says? You know, if this was a man who came into town, an upstanding man, hey, I think I might have found the Messiah, makes a little more sense. This is a woman who is at the bottom of society, maybe below the bottom of society. Whether she's done this to herself or not, I don't know. It doesn't say why she's been married 5 times. Doesn't really matter. But imagine the person that you would have the hardest time believing coming to you and say, hey, I found Jesus. Do you want to come meet him? Look what the people do though. Verse 39, it says, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. This woman who should have had no influence whatsoever. This woman who is, the least likely candidate to spread the gospel is spreading the gospel, is going and winning people to Christ. And again, I think that we get so lost in the fact of, yeah, well, I'm kind of a nobody. I don't have a big circle. I'm not a boss or a supervisor. I don't have anybody that answers to me. I don't have people that really look up to me. You may think that. Can I just challenge you a little bit today with just 3 quick thoughts? Because whether you realize it or not, everybody in here has influence on somebody. We have influence. It may not be a huge circle. It doesn't have to be a huge circle. We all have influence somewhere on somebody. I want to give 3 reminders that we can put into play on how we use this. The first is this: influence, we've already said it, it's not about followers, it's about your heart for people. Jesus had thousands and thousands and thousands of followers, tens of thousands of followers. That story where he feeds the 5,000, that's men. That's not counting women and children. It says 5,000 men were fed. So just, you can make an educated guess. If most of the men had a wife and kids, there's probably at least 20,000 people that are there that day. And that's kind of the peak of where he's at. But Jesus, even in the midst of crowds of people, was always focused on an individual person. What does he tell his disciples? If you got 100 sheep and you lose one, you leave the 99 and you go find the one. He's in a crush of people. Everybody's touching him. And one woman touches the hem of his garment. Who touched me? They're like, are you kidding? Everybody's touching you. No, one person touched me. And I want to find out who. I want to find out what she needs. Jesus approaches blind Bartimaeus and he asks him, what would you like me to do for you? Like, dude, you're blind and begging. It should be obvious. But Jesus had the heart to say, no, I want you to tell me what you want from me. It was always about a person for Jesus. And he passed it on to us. I've said this many times. My personal ministry mission statement is what Jesus says to his disciples, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And 3 times he tells us why. They're all people focused. He says in John chapter 10, I came to bring life and bring it to the full. We said earlier that salt flavors. That's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. Come to bring life to the full. Mark chapter 10, he says the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve. He goes on to say, and give his life as a ransom for many. I can't do that part. But I can pour out what I have for everybody else. I can serve people rather than just waiting to be served, like so many were in this culture. And in Luke chapter 19, he says the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. I like this one in particular because he says this particular verse while he is at the home of Zacchaeus. Remember the guy up in the tree? He was a tax collector, a dirty, rotten, no good sinner, a hated person by the Jewish people. And Jesus answers the church people, why are you eating with this rotten person? Because he goes, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. I came to seek and save the lost. Jesus was focused on people. Go back to what I asked earlier with your focus for this year. What if your focus was on one person? Who would that person be? What do you need to change in your heart to keep your heart focused there? Who's one person that your influence could reach for Jesus this year? I told you this a few weeks ago and when we wrapped up our Christmas series. All of us have a story that's unique. All of us have a story that we can tell that others can't. Last spring, my friend Caleb was here telling his story and how it ties to the LGBT community. And I brought him in because that's a story I can't tell because it's not my story, it's his. His story is one that will reach people that I can't reach. Your story is a unique gift that God gave you to reach the people he put in your path, to reach the people that you're going to interact with. You don't have to have a polished sermon. You don't have to have the books of the Bible memorized. You don't have to know who the 12 disciples were. You don't have to have this great, deep biblical knowledge to win somebody for Christ. You have to have your story of what God's done for you, and it has to be honest and humble and sincere in what Jesus has done for you. It's not about followers, it's about your heart for people. Here's our second thought when it comes to using your influence. Your life also doesn't have to be perfect to be influential. In fact, I would say that your life not being perfect probably makes your story more effective than if you were perfect. Here's the problem I think too many of us have. I heard this from a pastor friend of mine, kind of stuck with me. He said, too many Christians are too afraid to tell their story because we're too afraid of being looked at as frauds. Because we know we're not perfect, and so does everybody else. And as soon as I tell my story and somebody sees my sin, they're going to call me out on it. I think also, too, we have kind of two buckets, this bucket of what we've done and this bucket of what we know. I think we're too afraid somebody's going to ask us a question and we don't have an answer. I watched several years ago, there was a debate between a prominent atheist and Max Lucado. If you ever read any of his books, I love Max Lucado's heart. But several times in the interview, they asked a question, and Max Lucado just answered, I don't know. And he was honest and sincere about it. There's a bucket of what we know and don't know and what we've done and haven't done. And the problem is, a lot of people don't know what's in this bucket over here, but a lot of people do know what's in this bucket over here. And they would say, man, if they just knew my past, they would look at me as a fraud. If they know the struggles I have, they know the sins I still can't sometimes get over, they're just going to call me a fraud. They're going to call me a fake. You know who the most influential Christian has ever been? The most influential follower of God. A guy who wrote several letters in our New Testament, who by his writings shaped the way churches all over the Western world think today and preach today and believe today. A man who, before God got a hold of him, was murdering Christians, burning down churches. A man who had a sheet that was a mile long, who never hesitated to talk about it if he thought it was going to help people come to know Jesus. And here's what he wrote in 1 Timothy. He said, Christ Jesus came to the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. He doesn't act like he's got it all together. No, hear me out, church. The biggest frauds, they're not the Christians who have struggles. They're the Christians who act like they don't. They're the Christians who act like they've got it all together. They're the pastors who talk with a little different tone in their voice and act like they're the only experts and nobody could dare question them. They're the leaders who act like nobody dare question what I say or do. They're the people who pretend like they've got it all together. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs. You're pretty on the outside, but there's a lot going on the inside, and you're not going to let people know about that. You're just going to hide that, You're just going to see the good, pretty part of this. Your life should be a life of transparency. Doesn't mean that you've got to go around sharing your biggest struggles or your biggest things that you've done wrong with people. I have a friend back in Phoenix when we were together in our residency program. He was extremely extroverted. It's like the dude just wore me out, okay? Like dude, I can't handle your energy today. Every person he met, he wanted to go introduce himself to. And especially people at the church or people in ministry or whatever, he would always walk up to them and stick his hand out and go, hey, my name's Evan. What's your biggest sin? And if you just totally catch people off guard, he asked Elsie was 4 years old, so he asked her that. It's like he's just totally catching people off guard. He doesn't care, he's not wanting them to say that, but he's just trying to break the ice with people. You don't have to go like, hey, my name's Kurt. Here's my biggest sin, Here's my number one struggle in life. But one thing that I try to do, and I hope you all appreciate this, is when I'm preaching, how many times will I say, yeah, I should probably be out there listening to somebody else preach this today, because this is a struggle for me. I say that not because I'm trying to do anything other than just say, hey, I'm just like everybody else. I've got my struggles. I've got my issues. I've got my things that I wish I was better at. I got some things I wish I could let go of, just like everybody else. That's what transparency and honesty and humility look like. You don't have to tell the deepest, dirtiest secrets that you've got, but don't try to pretend like you've got it all together either. But here's the third thought. Sometimes that messy part of your story might just be what somebody needs to hear. Sometimes that messy part of your story might just be what somebody needs to hear. If you were at our men's conference last year, you saw this. So the rest of you, we had a guy here named Sean Barber. He came and spoke. Former player for the Chiefs, played a few other teams in the NFL, but guy who kind of lived the dream, playing professional football. And I'm sitting up here interviewing him, and I don't even remember the question I asked him, but he just took off and started answering it. And he starts rattling off all the stuff that he did. And I'm like, oh boy, I don't know where this is going. I'm sitting here next to him thinking, my thing is, I just hope I don't have a facial expression that gives away my initial thought when he says something here, But he just laid it all out there. And I don't know how many times he goes, I'm just calling it like it is. Just saying what I did. Can't undo it, so might as well talk about it. He's not saying that to brag about his life of sin. He's saying that because he knows somebody in that room probably has been in those same shoes. Probably has had their wife kick him out of the house. Probably has had his kids not want to have anything to do with him. He knows he's not the only one who's faced that. Maybe you know somebody who has shared a messy story with you, and it's brought you through what you were in the middle of. You don't have to just go like my buddy Evan, hey, what's your biggest sin? But maybe you get to a point with somebody where you've got the trust to say, hey man, I need to tell you something. I'm not proud of it, but this is something I did one time, and I want to make sure I never do it again. Because maybe that person is about to do the same thing you did. Maybe they're about to step into something that you don't want them to step into, and you did, and you're like, hey, here's the warning signs. You never know where somebody else is at. don't be afraid to use your story. Don't be afraid to use your influence, no matter how big or small you might think that it is. Because here's the thing you have to understand. All of us got to where we are because of the people around us. And I can start to rattle off again all the names, my parents, my grandparents, the people who, helped get me to where I'm at, the Sunday school teachers, the pastors. But I can tell you the names of people I had conversations with when I got into my early adulthood that made sure I stayed where I was at. Let me put a question on the screen here. Not really a question, more of a statement. And I want you to think about this and answer this if you can. I found Jesus because somebody shared their story with me. Now, you might be like me. I found Jesus because my mom really didn't give me any other choice. I told you that. Grew up in church, was there every week. It's like, yeah, well, this is what we do here. We follow Jesus in this household. But like a lot of kids who grew up in the church, I eventually got out on my own, went to college, started getting challenged with what I thought and believed. Early adulthood was kind of rough on me. And I had to make that decision. Do I want to continue this life that I was told I was going to live as a kid? And I know a lot of people who don't. It breaks my heart. I know a lot of people who have walked away from it, turned away from it. But it was conversations with a few specific people that made sure I didn't. How many people can answer this question and put your name in that blank? I found Jesus because James shared a story with me. I found Jesus because Cindy shared her story with me. I found Jesus not because Kurt preached a sermon or because, Brad's got a great church that he built here. I found Jesus because somebody shared their story with me. I said earlier, that's the only accomplishment you can take with you to heaven. And I hope one day I meet him in heaven, somebody I've never even met, and say, I'm here because of you. I'm here because of something that you said to me one time. Not because you were exegeting a scripture or telling me what this cool Greek word meant or giving me a great one-liner that you put up on the screen. But because of something you said about what Jesus did in your life. I'm here because of that. How amazing would that be? How amazing would it be to know that somebody found Jesus because of you? Where I went to a Bible college down in Joplin, Missouri, they have a 2-word slogan, kind of their 2-word motto that they use. It's just one. Just one. Their theory, their heart behind this is to target one person. Now for them, they kind of focus it a little bit into finding one person who will answer the call to ministry. But they always say who we teach you to love is more important than what we teach you to know. That's been a slogan, kind of the mantra, the founding academic dean, that was his great statement that he said all the time. Who we teach you to love is more important than what we teach you to know. And church, can we challenge you with that same thing? Who we teach you to love is more important than what we teach you to know. And I am big on learning the Bible. I'm big on learning knowledge, but it doesn't matter if you don't do something with it. Matthew chapter 9 is where they get this phrase from. Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So we ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. So can I just give you one challenge out of all of this today? As we try to go a little more all in for 2025, who's your one? Who's your one person that you're going to use your influence on to bring that person to Christ, to teach them about Jesus, to tell them about Jesus? Tell your story. Be humble and honest, be sincere. Understand that you've got a lot more influence than you realize, than you think, than you know. Pray and ask God, not just to put that person on your heart, but to give you the words, to give you the opportunities to do something about it. Father, we're so grateful that you gave us the mission to go into the world and make disciples, to baptize them, to teach them, to show them how to become like you. That you told us to go be your witnesses. Father, I pray that we would always look for that one. It may not even be the one that we automatically, immediately think of. But God, that somebody would come across our path and you would say, that's him, that's her. That's the person that I created, that I love, and that I died for. Go get them. Father, help us to have the courage, the confidence, but also the humility, God, to reach everybody that we can for you, one person at a time. I know, God, it's so easy to see this big world out there and think, what can we do? Because there's just millions and millions of people who don't know you. But God, show us we do it one person at a time. We're so grateful that you give us the challenge. We pray in Jesus' name.